Welcome, everyone, to today's discussion, the board's role in your company's financial strength. My name is Heather Spilsbury, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at 50/50 Women on Boards. As we wait for people to join, I'm just going to give you a couple seconds, but please engage in the chat and include your name and where you're from. We'd like to see where everyone's joining us from this morning. It's great to see so many faces and different people here attending today. Thanks so much for joining us. Again, my name is Heather Spilsbury, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at 50/50 Women on Boards. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we're a nonprofit 501c3 organization committed to advancing women in the pipeline to corporate board positions. We do this through our quarterly and annual research, our board readiness workshops, annual events, and advocacy efforts. Our goal is to have 50% of the corporate board seats held by women and 20% of all corporate board seats held by women of color. Today, we have an esteemed panel of public company board directors who will share their insights and experience on how boards are evolving and driving change in the modern business landscape. We're going to focus on exploring what drove our panelists to pursue public company board service, how they help position companies they serve with financial wellness to mitigate risk, the importance of diversity and inclusion within the board of directors and its committee, how 50 Women to Watch for Boards can help reverse the lack of diverse talent on boards. And with that said, I'm so excited to introduce our two panelists, and let's start with Irene, Chang, Britt, and welcome her to the virtual stage. Irene is a seasoned executive with a wealth of experience in general management, finance, and brand marketing. She's a former president of Pepperidge Farms and Campbell's Soup Company, and currently serves as an independent director of the boards of Brighthouse Financial, Micmac, Partake Foods, and Victoria's Secret. At Victoria's Secret, Irene is also the chair of the Human Capital and Compensation Committee and a member of the Audit Committee. Additionally, she serves as the chair of the board of Amica Senior Lifestyles. Irene previously served as an independent director of Men's Warehouse and Duncan Brands Group. Welcome, Irene. We're so happy to have you.
Great to be here. Thank you, Heather.
Our next guest is Michelle Collins. Michelle is an experienced executive and board member with a wealth of knowledge in finance and private equity. Michelle is the president of Cambian LLC, a consulting firm she has led since 2007. She currently serves on the boards of Ulta Beauty, Ryan Specialty Group, where she also sits on the audit committee, and CIBC Bank. With a proven track record of serving on public company boards, she's previously served as a director of Integris Energy Group, Molex, and Bucyrus International, and CDW Corporation. I always mess that one up. Welcome, Michelle. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks, Heather. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to get this conversation going. Sure. One of the things I wanted to start with was asking about how each of you created this path for yourself to serve on public company boards. Was it always part of your career plan, or did someone present the opportunity to you?
Irene, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Great question, because it was part of a career plan. And I was, at the time, this was a gajillion years ago, I was in the C-suite of Campbell's Soup Company. And our very prescient CEO said, listen, this is part of your development plan. To be on a board will make you such a better executive for us, because you'll understand the perspective of the board. And at that point, two of us were being groomed for CEO on the internal track, and we were each asked to go out and get our own board. Of course, I joked with the CEO at the time, is he going to get me one? He said, no, that's part of your learning. And in fact, it's so apropos for this audience, because it is part of the learning to go pursue that path and really figure out how to get those board opportunities.
Well, that's Irene, your experience is actually really interesting, because I have a contrasting, experience. I kind of come from the world of investment banking. So during the time I was doing investment banking, I was taking companies public. So I was actually helping companies form those first boards and try to help them evolve over time as they grew. CDW was one of those clients. And I grew up from a highly entrepreneurial, smaller company, environment, to growing up with companies that are now, larger and more sophisticated, but not as large and sophisticated as Campbell Soup and some of the ones that you've been doing. So it was never a career. It just kind of evolved from what I was already doing. And I loved my clients, and I loved, really high growth entrepreneurial companies. And it just was a natural to kind of get those opportunities and keep pursuing them. So it was great.
I love hearing both of your contrasting experiences, because
Mhm.
it is the nature of the business of getting on a board. Sometimes it's presented to you as an opportunity, and other times it's something that you really have to, kind of fall into or seek yourself. But I think in both paths, it is important to know that you made the effort to also do that and, position yourself for the right types of boards to serve on. And it's what we tell women all the time. It's not something that's going to fall in your lap necessarily, but if you take the steps in that direction, then the possibilities start to open up for you, especially when you start to network with others that can help you and sponsor you and support you.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'd like to dive in on how you ensure the financial reporting and accounting practices of companies where you serve as a board director are compliant with relevant regulations and industry standards. My first question is, how do you approach assessing and managing financial risk within the companies you serve as board of directors?
Well, I'll take a shot at that one, maybe to get started on this one. So I sit on the audit committees of all the boards I'm on, and have sat on the audit committees of all the boards I've been on. So the risk management is really just a kind of integral part from my perspective. And in fact, I choose to be on the audit committee because I understand the businesses more from the financial perspective. So the risk assessment and highlighting, what we need to focus on at the individual companies really starts with that risk assessment. There's enterprise risk management, which is kind of a overall board requirement. But from an audit committee, you have to have a risk assessment to do an audit plan with internal audit. And those often dovetail, but there's certainly more emphasis in the audit committee on more financial type things, IT, cybersecurity, those kinds of issues that, today talent is on the audit committee list, but it used to only show up on the enterprise risk management list. This is the way things have been changing lately. But anyway, that's common for almost all the companies that I've had, large, small, private, public, just been a very basic way to kind of start, but it's yielded good results. I'll pass it on to you, Irene.
Thank you, Michelle. So Michelle, absolutely 100% agree with her. That is exactly how we approach it. I'll go to be additive and not duplicative. I'll go just upstream a little bit, which is I'll go back to strategy. And you can only talk about risk in context of your strategy. And that's what we all start with, even before the enterprise risk management framework that Michelle so brilliantly talked about. Is when you think about your strategy and where you want to go, you have to then decide what your risk appetite is on that. Because honestly, you can take a very conservative view of risk and have one strategy, and a more lean into risk profile and have a totally different take on that same strategy. So I think it's really imperative to do that, get to the diligence of the enterprise risk management framework that Michelle talks about, and then flow it all the way through the committees especially, and then of course the board.
Yeah. Great point. So I have a question on the flip side. In terms of strategy and understanding how that works for a company, or what their focus is, or what their, what the new focus might be, let's say if they're going through transitional change or something of that nature, what can the board directors that actually serve as part of the company do to help guide the independent board directors? Because oftentimes I hear stories about, it's really important for us to have some insight into the day-to-day, but we don't always get that insight. So to make the right assessments, we have to make sure that we have all the correct information in front of us, right? And so how do then the board directors that serve at that company, whether it's the CEO or, founders or what have you, or whoever's part of it that's an integral part of the business, how do they present that information in a way that's sufficient enough to someone like the both of you, who's looking ahead from that assessment standpoint and risk mitigation standpoint to say, oh, this strategy looks to be well thought out, but here are the things you might be missing, or here are some, gaps where we need to take some focus or
Well,
do
I think, yeah, I was just going to throw in there that an independent director that's not, an insider, first of all, I would just say the topic of board reporting is always very dominant. Independent directors want more. Management is like, okay, they want too much and we want it smaller, but we want it more informative. So always a never ending debate. But I think, as a director, you need to, especially if you're part of the strategy, have help if you are part of developing the strategy or reviewing the strategy, you need to know for yourself what you're looking for. And you're asking management typically to provide things, hopefully not that's an extra burden, but sometimes it might be, to help inform you. And if you're not getting it, you've got to do something about that, because that is absolutely required for you to actually do your job. On the other hand, I've seen situations where people are really, there's that phrase, nose in, fingers out, and they want too much, that are calling management all the time, and that's just sort of not my style with it. I want to be in touch, I want to engage, but I don't want to, I'm not another management person. So I've got to make that distinction and enable the manager to know that I'm not another management person. Irene, do you have a different perspective?
No,
or
very similar, but I'll just add to that, which is, listen, the information is always going to be asymmetric, right? If you're in management, you're going to have all the information, and you're going to, in the few short hours that you have with your board once a quarter or maybe a little bit more, you're going to deliver that information, and it's in your own best interest to deliver that information that makes you look good,
Right.
Frank, right? Hey, I was there, right? We were all there in management. That's why we're on boards now. So, but it's to Michelle's point, it is about the director knowing the beautiful questions to ask, right? You have to know what you're looking for. It's not a gotcha. It's just an inquisitive stance, so that you can actually get the information that you need to make decisions and judgments on. I would say that important to this conversation is for the board and the CEO and the C-suite to be very clear on the framework that they're using for strategy and for data to come through against that framework, right? So know what you're getting and be able to drill down into it. And I would say for board members, Michelle, you probably agree with me on this, is that this is not a job that starts when you get the board book a week later, then you turn up for the meeting, you spend your 1.5 days, and then you leave. That's not your job. I call this my 24/7 part-time job. And I'm on multiple boards. So I have multiple, like you do, Michelle, 24/7 part-time jobs. Because in between those meetings, you're constantly reading about the industry, you're talking to people, you're going to webinars, you're learning and learning and learning. So that when you get that board book, boy, oh boy, you know what you want to ask, because, I read that the consumer price index was going da 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 da. How is that affecting X board, Y board, Z board? That's the thinking that you have to do 365 days of a year, not when you receive the board book.
That's absolutely correct. And I'll just add really quickly, just because it was a fun fact, but I just came back from an Ulta, what we call our FLC, Field Leadership Meeting Conference. And, oddly enough, as a board member, I would say that meeting is more important to go to than any of the board meetings that I've actually attended with the company. And they do a great job, but that's where actually the culture and the, marketing of the company actually comes to life. And you can see whether it's real or if it wasn't real, real. But you really, frankly, how do you really know as a director is always a question you have. And, at least for me, this particular field, leadership conference is a way for me to see into the company in ways that you wouldn't otherwise get from just a board book. So that's the point of extra time and investment. Should
Yeah.
be.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think those are really great points. And it's good to
Mhm.
hear from that perspective too. And also I think it's great for people to position themselves for board service. So like you were saying, making sure that you have the right strategy and the framework and the data points to support that so the board can see you in action. And then that's another way to, have an in if you're looking for a board position, to really present yourself in that way so someone sees what you've done and how you present yourself in the work that you're producing. So all great points. I think, from our perspective too, even at 50/50, we're always striving to make sure that the board has a great understanding of what we're trying to achieve. And sometimes that opens up, like you said before, a dialogue or questions. And it's not we're trying to, probe you or say, we got you. It's more like, have we thought of these things? Have you explored it from that perspective? Michelle, I was going to ask you, with your experience in private equity, can you discuss how you apply that expertise to your work on public company boards and audit committees?
Well, yeah, I'll be brief on this one because I think they actually go back and forth. The private equity experience as the owner and the only investor, if you will, typically, or with somebody else, is the person that we're serving on the public company boards. So I'm try to ask questions with that lens and ownership lens on public companies that I've learned from the private equity. But the other thing, probably more importantly, is just actually the owning the whole board agenda in the private equity world, the strategy, the risk management, the financials, but also really the front end of the business, whatever the leadership, it could be sales or service or product or whatever it is, but you've got to own that even more than I think the role is in the public company world. But I think it goes back and forth because, frankly, knowing and understanding the front end of the business is actually really critical to being a really good board member in general. So you take that with you in the public company place. So I've learned, I think the only other thing I would say is about the private equity is that because it's, we don't have that same sort of management versus the director's perspective, you get a little more detailed. And so you're looking at, sometimes you're looking at journal entries, sometimes you're doing 13-week cash flow statements. It's good to let the people in the public companies know you know how to do that.
Yeah.
So.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's really good insight.
Mm-hmm.
For the two of you, how do you ensure effective communication and collaboration between the audit committee and other committees on the board?
Yeah, I think I'll take a stab at that. I think one of the things is that you have to understand what is necessary to go across, right? And you want to be efficient about that. And so I'll take, for example, audit committee input to things like finance and risk committees, investment committees. If a company has that, especially in financial services, Michelle, which you and I are on, we would have those extra committees. But the standard committees, I have found that compensation, human capital and compensation, and audit have to be pretty tied together, especially around comp season. Making sure that we tick and tie and triangulate what the financial objectives are of the company, and what is the risk management of compensation against those objectives as well. We've had, unfortunately, things in the industry where certain executive incentives have put the company at, not the companies I'm dealing with, but as we all know, I'm not going to name companies, but in the news, we have heard of companies that financial incentives for executives actually generated more risk. And that's where compensation and audit had to be really tied in, probably more than they were. Who knows? I don't know those situations, but I make sure in the companies that I'm involved with that those two things cross over.
Yeah, that's great. I think in general, I'll just again add to, not repeat, that I do think that there's merging kind of cross fertilization, if you will, that the issues in companies today actually are not in discrete little buckets, but they really do need to be managed as kind of, like enterprise thinking, I guess, applied to a corporate board. And so, there are some things that will always come across, but I think other things are starting, with the advent of ESG, where people actually manage that, where people double check it, all can differ a little bit amongst various companies. I think they're, the IT, the cybersecurity issues, will show up in audit, but might be risk management, but also might be in ESG, which may not be a separate committee, maybe in NomGov. So you've got a range of issues that come across the board, and I think it's evolving kind of what the agenda is going to be like for each committee, because it's changing right now, and issues are emerging. So
yeah, no, and that bleeds right into the next question, which is so great in terms of like, what do you believe are the developments and changes that will impact the future of the audit committee or other committees?
Like every day, something.
Every day, something.
there's always
audit committee list is really long, right?
And it gets longer every single day, doesn't it? But I would say that the biggest thematic change and what's hanging over all of us from a responsibility standpoint is tech and cyber, right? There's accounting changes all the time, LIBOR replacement, blah blah blah. You can keep on going, but it's that whole tech and cyber issue and or opportunity. Certainly not only your prevention and defenses, but also your diligence around resilience of the company when your company is breached, as everybody is obviously attacked. And how do you tie into your other point, Heather, is how do you tie in your other committees and the rest of the board into that strategy, rather than just leaving it with the risk committee or the audit committee, however you handle that. And I think that's the biggest thing that we are constantly talking about, not to rehash, but to renew our defenses and our resilience, because it is a game of constant renewal.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I would just add that I think maybe to that question, that point that you're making, Irene, that I think maybe more formal, mechanisms like using all the chairs of committees to form an executive committee and make sure that there's coverage across the board. Because I think, again, as these things in just over 30 years, you've seen trends come and trends go, right? And yet you want to see, you don't want to put in place something permanent until you're really sure that it's going to stick. And so I think one way to cross-fertilize to be sure you're comfortable is to get that formal, meeting of all the chairs and make sure that you're having those conversations now, and then figure out later a little bit where it actually lands.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. No, that's wonderful insight. So helpful to our audience too. Can you discuss any best practices or advice you'd have for individuals looking to serve on public company audit committees? Oftentimes we tell women, if you're looking for a board, make sure you're explaining your expertise and your experience adequately, and what committee you could immediately serve on. So in terms of audit committee, obviously having a financial background is always necessary, but is there anything else in terms of the advice you give women who are seeking that type of position?
Well, I actually think saying that you're interested and willing to do it is a big first step, because a lot of people don't really like, they're even surprised, like, why do you want to serve on a audit committee? And just, I guess the way my brain works, but I like the numbers, so I start there and work my way into the words. And I think that's truly one of the key things, because I think a lot of folks don't like to serve on audit committees. So if you are somebody who is willing to do that and step in, and I would encourage it, because I do really think you learn a lot about companies through the audit committee, I would definitely raise your hand, not just that I'm interested in the board, but that I'm also interested in serving on an audit committee.
I'm just going to double click on what Michelle said. That is That is such a compelling thing to say in the interview, because usually people assume people run from the hills on audit committees,
Right.
run for the hills, but it is compelling to want to be on it. It is also, so if you come from obviously a financial background like Michelle does, you are a shoe-in. But also from my standpoint, I don't come from a financial strict like CFO or CPA or whatever designation. I have run businesses. I run P&Ls and balance sheets, and that is a financial expert in most cases,
Yeah. Yeah.
enough to be on an audit committee. So I think people who run line businesses should definitely, consider themselves a candidate.
I just have to add to that, if it's okay. I think Irene is making 100% the best point. Operating experience is coveted. So, yes, for audit committees, but just in general. So I think if you are running a P&L, certainly if you're willing to be on the audit committee, that's great. In fact, one of the boards I'm on, we actually require everybody go on the audit committee as their first stint around the board, as their first committee.
That's right.
But I also think that the P&L experience is just really critical, and I think a lot of people know that. But I'm just reminding folks that's important.
That's a great reminder.
Yeah.
It is a really good reminder.
Mhm.
Our latest initiative, the 50 Women to Watch for Boards initiative, aims to assist in companies seeking diverse talent by spotlighting women who are board ready but not yet serving on a public company board. Both of you are on our selection committee, and we're so proud to have you. Can you speak to the importance of diversity and inclusion within the board of directors and audit committee, and how you work to promote diversity and inclusion in your roles?
Yeah, I'll start. It is so important to have diversity, and I do start with diversity of thinking, but that's not a cop out to not have actual diversity of gender and race and sexual identification and age, by the way.
Right.
What I do know is that those things actually bring a lot of diversity of thinking as well, and sometimes you need the people both in at the board and at the audit committee and other committees to bring that lateral thinking from a different industry, from a different background. That is what makes the conversation a lot richer.
Yeah, and I just would say that it's a lot of my experience has been getting from there to here with the diversity. It is totally worth it when you get there, go through the struggles of everybody trying to kind of get to understand each other, know each other, and open their minds and everything. Sometimes it's quite a struggle, but when you get there, and it really does work beautifully. You really think about things in a more thoughtful, considerate, but hopefully more competitive and business strong methodology. So I highly recommend it, but I also recognize that you don't see the benefits of it necessarily right up front. It's worth fighting for. So.
Yeah. Back to your point with the Ulta experience, I'm sure part of that has to do with meeting in person and having those collaborative discussions where it just helps the bond become a little bit different and more impactful.
Sure. Well, yeah, and as Irene knows with retailers, I mean, you've got this incredible opportunity to bring up young people. So you've got to be in person, and you've got to do development, and you've got to think, in a lot of different ways, because you're dealing with the people straight up. So it's I think it's really, really rewarding, but it's hard work too.
Yeah.
Invest in it.
Well, we've run out of time because this conversation has just been so incredible, and I really could talk to you for hours, and I'm sure the audience could listen for hours. But just to close it out, what impact do you think the 50 Women to Watch for Boards initiative will have on increasing diversity on corporate boards?
Oh, I'm hoping for a huge impact. Like, really, what I love about this program is it's spotlighting women specifically. And Michelle and I both look for people to be on boards, and having this spotlighted by an organization that has vetted it with certain criteria and to pick the best of the best is just going to be so helpful to all of us in the board industry.
It's absolutely a game changer to kind of scale. I'm saying the same thing that Irene is saying, scale that getting to know you phase so that you can actually go in with complete trust and recommend, because as I always tell people, it's not always a formal process. Somebody may ask you, like, just on the spot, Michelle, who do you think, I'm looking for more board members. And so, you're standing there with, completely unprepared, unless you're always thinking about who could be on certain boards. And I've been caught like that more than once. And I swore to myself I would never be unprepared again. So I'm always looking, always in my mind, evaluating which could they go to? What do they want to do? So it, and when you're relying on that, you realize how limited it is, because it's only who I see. But 50-50 women on boards is, kind of multiplier effect many, many times.
I agree with that. That's a great way to frame it. I think it happens to all of us. When you're caught off guard and immediately have to think about something, you can't always think of it. But if you've got a resource to go to, then I think that's really helpful to help generate those ideas and look outside of your network.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both, Irene and Michelle, for sharing your expertise today. We've enjoyed this discussion so much. We're going to have you back, because it was just so incredible. And I know both of you have such a wealth of knowledge, and just based on how you've served on boards and the companies that you've run, we just thank you so much for being with us today. And thank our audience for being with us today too. We encourage you all to continue the conversation in your own organizations and corporations and communities to support the efforts that promote diversity and inclusion in all aspects of business. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.